PM. PM.
PM. AM. Yeah. Go. Hello? Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to set up my camera first. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Several points of crucial set up from the get-go. Firstly, we as OG, we regret the increasing influence of consulting firms such as local consulting firms or even outside of nations consulting firms itself, exactly because it's increasing a little bit too much. How is that? So I'll prove to you why why is that harmful in my contribution. So this looks like in Indonesia, for example, there's a less popular and amount of consulting firms in Indonesia, for example. We think people need to opt out to outside firms, outside consulting for the government itself needs to opt out to consulting firms that is outside of Indonesia, exactly because there is a less the consulting firms in Indonesia itself is having a lesser impact towards the government because they have more influence outside of Indonesia. If the influence is that impactful, we think it's going to be based on what they think it should be from the consulting firms. This means that if the consulting firms is that if really have that in if the increment means the influence is that impactful coming from the consulting firms, this means the impact is really that massive from towards the government, meaning the government on both sides of the house are going to directly takes what is coming from the consulting firm and implemented in their society, in their nation, for example, and this is harmful. We think when it's going to be based on what those consulting firms thinks it should be, it's not going to be a consulting anymore. Then it will only becomes a dictations of those consulting firms onto the government's policy, which is going to be harmful. So secondly, opposition have to defend a world where the impact of increasement of influence from consulting firms designing public policy that resulting in tangible impact to people on the ground for government is justified, is fine, and it's not harmful with questions. Why? Moving on to my contribution, that first argument, why the increasement of influence brings more harm than good. Premise, when we lessen the influence coming from consulting firms within the current status quo, this means government is more likely to stick to the people on the ground, to listen to their aspirations, to their opinions, and instead of going outside and searching for the opinions coming from the consulting firms itself, locally or globally. So of if there is a last amount of it, people's aspirations would be prioritized on our side of the house. If there is a less amount of government searching for consulting firms of uh outside or even consulting firms itself, we think people's opinion will be the first prioritizations from the governments to be listened to be implemented in the public policy. So moving on to my first layer, why is there a need for people's aspirations to be prioritized and what is the urgency? We think there is several points. Where currently people feel like they are not being heard enough, therefore we make them being make people voices to be heard on our side of the house by considering their opinion first on our side. B, and this looks like there is a lot of protest going on in social media exactly because people's needs are not being catered to there, and the facilities that people need are not being provided by the government. For example, if a area are not are urgently needing for healthcare facilities, for example, or their education's qualities are not that good, for example, but the public policies from the governments are not directly catering to that to those kind of people. We think this kind of vulnerable people are are going to be catered towards on our side of the house. So the moment when we are not reducing the influence coming from the consulting firms that impacts to the public policies made by the government. So why is this important then? Exactly, because most nations are democratic, or at the very least care or prioritize on how happy people are in their nations. So when you are able to cater to people aspirations on our side of the house, people are more likely to cooperate with whatever the government needs or asks for those people to do, such as compliance in rules or paying taxes to build the nations even
Right.
better. So simply, it is that people on our side of the house are going to be happier, exactly because their welfare and whatsoever are more catered towards too. And it's one of the most important thing to consider when we are making a public policy as a government. So that is the reason why government on our side of the house in OG will fulfill their responsibility as a government to cater to their citizens. And that is the reason why this is relevant. So, second layer, what is the third layer, what is the likelihood that when we're talking about economic or politics and how to make people engage in policy such as infrastructure, facility system, and etc., and many more, uh, even more. So this means consulting firms have exactly because consulting firms have different perspectives than the current government, than the people on the ground. We think we cannot simply make their vision and mission to be the same, exactly because what consulting firms thinks is probably more on to the profit oriented aspects, and people's are more on their what should be catered to their needs, and this is more people needs based on. So consulting firms want to make infrastructures to help profit and whatsoever, but that is going to hurt the people civilians on the ground. Why is that so? For example, in Bali, people want to make bridge from Bali to an island, for example, but people believe when you make the bridge, bad things will happen whatsoever. So the beliefs here are different from consulting firms outside of Indonesia. Most likely, they want to look for something different. And that is the reason why this is going to be harmful, because the vision and mission doesn't align. So how will this be better achieved under our side? That if there is no increasement of impact from the consulting firms, you're more likely to listen to the people first rather than taking it for granted, only taking it raw from the consulting firms, leading to you not catering to the people. When the main purpose, the reason why you became government and are elected by the people is to cater to the people. This will only be achieved on OG. Second argument, better quality of policy. First, according to people aspirations, people felt listens easier to cater to people because it's based on their needs. It's going to be more applicable and more accepted by the society as a whole since they felt catered and understood by the government. Second, the public policy making on OG will suit the personality of their people, resulting in a better communications between government and people, exactly because they are heard on our side of the house. This is the likelihood that we provide to you. So proud to
Okay, next, Elo.
Hello, I'm audible.
Yes.
POI unmute. Wait. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think some fine here before we get to this debate, right? I think PM has failed to understand that this debate is talking about counter narrative, so they have to actually bring a counter narrative on what will actually look like on their side in the first place, right? So that is already missing. But secondly, they don't even explain to you what does design public policy for government means. I think it's simple, right? It means that the government will still take the input people, which are the aspirations, and then they will give the input to the consulting firms, and then they will design the policy only. Dot there. It's just designing, and then for example, or the check and balances will then still be on the government. And I think this is something which I will explain later. But then let's still engage to OG, right? OG come to this debate saying that consulting firm can be influenced by other agendas. I will explain why this won't happen. But first, I think this is simple, right? I think consulting has their own popularity and they have their own names to maintain for. So I think if they want to actually bring in their own agendas in this public policy designing, it means that this is something that's very improbable in the first place, right? Because they know who they are work for, and they know that if they quote unquote make mistakes, then it could be the end for them in the end of the day, right? But I will explain this later. But then on to their second points, they claim that government will be able to look out on people's aspirations, can reach more vulnerable people, they can be heard enough by the government. I think this is completely untrue because will do their work on both sides anyway, right? I think it's not as side that how government will just hear the people on their side. I think it's very uncharitable because government will still work on our side. But even if government doesn't do anything as how they claim the status quo is, it means that consulting firm will do everything, right? And we think this is better than we are going. If the government is that lazy, it means that it's very possible they will just hire consulting firm, that many consulting firm throughout the country, and see what is the consensus aspiration every region is. And then what they can actually reach to each policy better, they can reach to each vulnerability better, and they can actually reach vulnerable actors on our side. What OG has proposed to you, which has no analysis as whatsoever. So then this comes to my arguments. First, I will explain to you how does this actually there is no urgent score, and then secondly, why consulting firms are still better on our side, right? So firstly, why is there no urgency? I think this is simple. As I stated before, governments still do their work. Firstly, input will still from government. Problems from people are still received by government via representative, for example, or via their own aspirations, which are only given to the government. I think this is something on both on our side because aspirations to government can just happen when the government works, when government want to work on our side, this input will be better. And then secondly, the output look like? I think the output can be two scenarios, right? First, the output the public be from the government itself, or secondly, it can be from the consulting firms, right? But on this case, we will be talking strictly about consulting firms. But before that, output will still be checked even firms are doing the output right. Because government will not just blatantly pull out some policy and then just implement it because they think that, oh yeah, this is that we buy, okay, do this. I don't think that's something very probable because we have to understand that if the government is already hiring public policy, then we can see that the government are not doing their job properly. It means that they are trying to redeem themselves for making bad public policy in the past, right? I think that's the context is very, and that is something that we need to actually look into. It means that yes, they might be a bit lazy to do their work, but at least on our side, we then don't criticize government on trying to redeem themselves, on trying to do their work, like on trying to make a better public policy, for example, on how to make a better consulting, how to make a better input intake, for example, and all of those things. And this is something that is better on our side because we don't actually criticize the government for what they do, right? So then it comes to my second argument then. The harms coming from consulting firms is basically non-existent. I think first, integrity and popularity to maintain. I think this is something that is very simple and is done by every firms, right? Not only consulting firms, but also companies to make their quote-unquote CV look good to everyone so that people want to buy them, for example, want to hire them, for example. They are trusted by the people in the first place, right? So that if go say that they will bring their own agendas, for example, they will make will make something as like a dictatorship, for example. I think it's very improbable because a check and balances from the professional firm itself. But then, second layer, moreover, their client is the government. I think this is something very simple that we need to understand, right? You don't want to mess. If you mess with the government, then the government can do anything to you. Even Petros, for example, or just example. And those kind of things are something that is important here because the power imbalance, it puts the consulting firm in the lower place and it puts government in the higher place and it just make them fear of the government in the first place. So that is very improbable. And even if it's probable, then I have already explained to you why there will still be check and balances from the government itself. So then on my second layer, not all consulting firms are bad and have agenda in the first place. I think this is something that is very uncharitable coming from government because they just claim that all consulting firms are bad and have agenda. But even agenda, I think it is not very probable that they are going to be government because then the government will still see which consulting firms are good. They will wit that what consulting firms are actually, for example, benefiting. Want to make public policy of environment. They then hire environment consulting firms, for example, because there are many consulting that actually professional in many kind of things, right? So first they can still choose, and then secondly they can weed out the bad ones. I think simple, and it is something that is very status quo analysis and why you should vote for OO.
Okay, next DPM.
Am I clear and audible?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. We think that normal consulting firms are not necessarily evil, that they might have our best interest in mind, but it does not mean it is fit with the values and the personality of people in Indonesia. What happens currently when you are raising it, when it is increasing, is the increasing part of government saying that, oh, let's just rely completely on consulting firms. Moving on to my responses. One, OO is being too best case. We think that not all consulting firms will be perfect in their policy making. We think, therefore, it is better for us to be able to be more calculative based on the things that we know about our countries more as a government. That means that we should not have increase. It should mean that we only consult when we only need it the most. I think that at best case, when it does give any economic policy or better political policy, it creates an over-reliance for consulting firms, especially people who are foreign, because people who are consulting these people are usually people who are underdeveloped, like Indonesia or Philippines. It means that you are only paying for foreign countries to do this. That means that there's a lot of budget that you have to constantly do if you are in an increasing overly reliance on these foreign countries. This means that if you want to make something that is economic or politic, that means that there's always going to be bureaucratic communication from these consulting firms. That means that's going to take longer. That means that it's going to be making these people not very effective in the first place. Secondly, we think that even if it works, we think it's not sustainable because at one point you have to get rid of these consulting firms in the first place. The fact that it is increasing, that if it actually works, means that the government will not try to let themselves go in the first place. That means that you cannot grow as a country. That means that you're only going to listen to the interest of someone else. That means that it's not going to always be aligned to the people that is into you. That is not sustainable policy. That's one responses. Two, OO shot themselves in the foot by saying that sure, government might be lazy, but less people are going to criticize. Government then, in their side, looks like they don't want to take accountability. This is why it's likely for them to actually take it for granted, because they're feeling that there's less accountability to be taken if they use consulting firms. They just want the best policies without having any consequences. This means that when they do it, when on consulting firms, this lessens the consequences for the government. That means the government is likely to become more lazy in making policies and just wasting it on consulting firms in the first place. This is bad because this is a simplification of consequences. That means that if the government thinks that they know the consequences is exactly what the firm tells them to, it does not mean that they're actually ready for it. That means that if the policy actually fails, the government does not have to take accountability for it. The people cannot backlash the government to be able to fix the policy in the first place because it's not our fault. It is the consulting firms. This means that it is harder for you to have any check and balance for the policy to actually work in the first place. This is not good for the people. Likelihood on listening to
Joy?
aspirations more. Yes?
what you're engaging to is just a part of my arguments. I've already explained to you that you are also not charitable on saying that the government will be lazy at all.
Okay, the government might not be lazy, but they sometimes overly simplify exactly because we think that this is already normalized when you are increasing it. When you're normalizing it, people are going to feel like you are already doing this more. And because other political makers are saying that, oh, it's good anyways, the future might be that they are going to rely on it more. Let's take the best case that they do not rely on it. We think that it still does not sometimes fit with the aspirations or values of the people, which moves on to my counterfactual. We think that if there is no increase in the first place, firms that are good at making calculations, you need less calculation for the government, right? With these firms, and people are competent. What happens is if you have no increase, is that people are more likely to consult when they need it first. So that means that the people who are aspirations in the first line in the ground are more likely to be listened by the government because they do not have that ability or that freedom to actually build in the first place. It looks like the culture is made in the policies and politically, people are not likely to make the culture that to normalize consulting firms first instead of you're actually just listening to the aspirations of the people. What does it look like? Because that sounds like jargon. When we talk about aspirations of the people, it looks like people who are in IKN does not wanting to people building something there because it hurts the natural resources there. It creates floods, but exactly it creates a better economic policy and better political policy for people who are on the ground. It makes better marketing. This is the type of consulting things that the consulting firms telling them to do. Exactly, people on the ground are being hurt. When you are doing extraction of natural resources, it is good for the country, but sometimes it is bad for people who are on the ground because they're using mercury to extract all of these materials. It means that the aspirations of the people are less likely to be heard, exactly to have an economic policy and political policy to move forward to actually just get votes in the next election, for example. This looks like the government simply saying that, oh, people's aspiration does not matter as long as we profit first, then we can cater to them forever. This is a problem because when it is increasing in numbers, the government forgets to actually go back to the people who they hurt in the first place because they overly simplify or think that the consequences are not that big because simply the benefit that they're reaping is much too big. This is why it's likely for government not quote be lazy but underestimate the people on the ground and their values, right? The increase of influence does not mean you're just consulting, right? That means that when you are influencing, their contribution is needed. It looks like votes being able to be put into these people more instead of just saying, oh, I think this is the case, so we're going to balance it equally. Increase of influence does not mean increase of frequency as well. It is also an increase in how the things that they said matters to your public policy. I think the one that is important to make a public policy, therefore the tipping point of making a public policy for a government is not just the benefit in the first place, but whether or not it fits the aspirations of the people. When you fit more to the aspirations of the people, you're likely to get more people listening to your policies in the first place in the future. It looks like people wanting to actually pay taxes. It looks like people actually listening to your policies that is about health, for example. This means that people are more loyal to you. That means that you get more let's see participation if you're a democratic country. This is why if you fit into the people's aspiration more, your policies in the futures are more likely to work in the first place. And this is also the principle of the government to be wanting to listen to the aspirations of the people. Therefore, yeah, proud to be OG.
Next, Yellow.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
You are unmute. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think to understand why OG has failed to fulfill their burden to proving why then when you regret the increase of influence of consulting firms, suddenly on their side the government would have better decision making, suddenly make better public policies when it has already been challenged by my first speaker, right? By Lewis in the very first place. I think they understand to the extent where status quo constantly makes bad public policies coming from the government. They understand to the extent where government has to constantly reprimand their wrongdoings to the people. And honestly, this influence from consulting firms, them hiring consulting firms is a way for them to reprimand their losses, right? The amount of resources they lost because they did something that was not in line with their people, them actually consulting professionals of these fields are a way for them to actually reprimand their wrongdoings. You regretting the increase of influence coming from these consulting firms just cuts off another resource coming for the government, from our government, to actually reprimand their wrongdoings and making bad public policies or making bad decision making in the very first place. But let's engage a bit to what OG has said, right? Essentially, they just worry the fact that these consulting firms will not fit the people, right? That's why they brought a lot of examples talking about like the conditions in Inka or Bali or whatever. Panelsas engaged to this. Understand that if anyone is going to listen to the people's problem, it's literally the people that are professionals in this field, listening to people's problems, analyzing them per field, and then make solutions to consult it to the people that needs them or consult it to the people that exactly hires them. This is literally how consulting firms work. Listen to problems, analyze the problems and the root cause of it, create a solution, then consult it to the clients that hired them. In this case, it's the government or pemerintah. These are professionals panels. They won't be professionals if they cannot take into account little things like culture influences in Indonesia, things that influences other fields that are abundant, that is also impossible for our government to fully understand to that extent, right? That's why they consult to these people in the very first place, consult to professionals in the very first place, because it'll be very, very idealistic to expect the fact that our government that has been wrongfully doing us for like ages now and is an ongoing problem that they're trying to solve, to understand every single field and what they need specifically, but also catering to a majority of people, not considering all of their backgrounds and different economic statuses, right? This is exactly why we should just let them consult with these firms, exactly letting the influence coming from these firms to help design public policies for the government, because this is the government's way to understanding the needs of the people better. This is exactly what OG wants, right? For the government to understand the people's needs and for them to accommodate to the people on the ground. This is
POI,
exactly what they need to do. Later, Philip. But exactly then, the biggest thing on OG that was never answered by them, or actually the biggest burden that they needed to prove in this debate, is why when you regret the suddenly bad policy making, or like the threat of bad policy making without consulting with that bad policy making is suddenly then non-existent on their side, or when they regret the increasing influence or the use of consulting firms to help design public policy for government, suddenly the government on their own can make good public policies or design good public policies that won't falter in the end, right? Which is something that we haven't been see do accurately in status quo, and it only got better after they started hiring a lot of consulting firms, right? But then before I get into my comparisons, yes, your POI.
Okay, how will the government understand the people's needs, like you're saying, if you're also saying that it's the consulting firm's jobs to do all of the understanding the people's needs?
It's basically like me listening to my coach matter to me on like social justice issues. The fact that these are knowledgeable people in the fields, these are people that has done years of research and years of background check, etc., to tell me exactly what's going on, what's the problem, and what is then hopefully the solution to it all. I don't understand what's the big problem of listening to other people that knows more than you. The government understanding that these people know more than them and admitting to it and actually hiring these people to help teach them or to help them understand is not something that we see as something faulty or something that should be shamed upon. It looks like the government understanding that they do need help understanding the people on the ground, that they do need help in certain fields, and we think that it's totally unjustifiable for you to suddenly regret those efforts coming from the government, right? But exactly, let's get into my contribution then. I'm going to compare to you very simply panels on what the worlds would look like then, on like why it's not inevitable incredibly regrettable. 3 layers to this. Firstly, what it looks like when you're regretting the increase of influence. 2, why status quo is significantly then better, and why then even in the long term we're still better when we don't regret it. Firstly, on OG, consulting firms then being hired by the government will lessen and lessen when you regret it. But why is this such a big harm? Things to understand, panel. 2 points. 1. Consulting firms are professionals of various and specific fields. The government cannot possibly know it all, and this is their attempting to know it all in the very first place, right? We cannot hold the idealistic view that our government should know all the nitty-gritty details and problems that Indonesia is facing. That's kind of hard to do, and that's exactly why bad policy making happens in the very first place. It looks like the government thinking that we need a certain thing, but honestly what they're doing is making it worse, right? This is what they're trying to not do, and what they're trying to do better in the future when they consult to these firms. But secondly, the increasing influence and popularity of these consulting firms creates a check and balance of the consulting firms getting
Yeah, I
hired
think
by these government in the very first place, right? We cannot deny that there is an increase of like establishing consulting firms being on the rise, etc. This directly solves every single problem coming from government. The fact that, oh, but what if this consulting firms is not in line with Indonesia's goals? Oh, but what if these consulting firms are very profit oriented and they're just gonna make policies that are profit oriented in return? This rise atau this increasing influence is exactly going to make the check and balance for this government to opt into consulting firms that literally has the best interest at heart, or the ones that actually consult good solutions that the government actually needs. Knowing the fact that there is always going to be market segmentation, where there's a price, there's a quality, right? It happens the same way in consulting firms as well. By you regretting the influence that these consulting firms have on designing public policy for the government, you're only going to be doing 2 things. 1, you're going to take away extra resources for the government to exactly redo or redeem their faults. But secondly, you're just taking away any possibility of check and balance happening naturally for these consulting firms in the very first place, right? On our side, the fact that the government is trying to know more of the problems going on is already a step in the right direction. The fact that they're consulting with people that know better than them shows that there is an effort to change and an effort to exactly reprimand all of the bad public policy designing that they've done in the past, right? On government long term, bad policy making will still be more prominent and will still happen. Vote for opening opposition. That's all for my speech.
MG.
Hi, audible?
Yes.
All right. For POI, please raise your hand. Prioritizing opening. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest flaw in OO here is they imagine that government consulting to these firms is like government learning from a teacher. But no, if you read the motion, governments hire the firms to design the policy. It's like you paying someone else to do your homework. This is the biggest flaw in opening opposition logic, and we'll explain to you why exactly is this whole reliance on consulting firm is going to be harmful. Because when you take a look, the consulting firms that are like private companies providing these services, we're talking about Deloitte, PwC, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, which are mostly multinational companies run by foreigners. Not only that, when you're talking about like the executive level, they are foreigners. These consulting firms, they would be used by the government exactly are this kind of like super international juggernauts because they have the most skilled people. But let's be charitable and realistic. These firms has been in Indonesia for like so long, they might be aware of the people's aspiration, like and so on. But the biggest problem here lies within the government because the government needs the consulting firms in areas where they are lacking. That is why they need external help. So the reliance of like increasing reliance and influence over consulting firm manifests like the harm will manifest in 2 folds. 1, when you create reliance on this firm that has no responsibility over the long-term welfare, you're destroying your country. Because the consulting firms, they provide their services for a transaction of contract, meaning they're paid to resolve a single issue, and any subsequent issues coming from their solution is not within their responsibility. It's not within their concern. So even worse, when they pursue money and the revenue stream is when the government consults to them when there is a problem, they might intentionally make a flawful like solution that could seemingly provide a short-term solution, but in the long run, it could be messed up. But let's say on the scenario where the consulting firm is effective, they're so noble, they're so helpful. This is exactly where the problem becomes big because you allow the creation of incompetent cabinets within the government. Like it or not, people in Deloitte, PwC, and many other multinational consulting firms, they are probably smarter than most of the ministers in countries like Indonesia. The use of like this consulting firm means you don't need a smart functional government, and this is the gateway to nepotism and collusion because you can hire and put anyone you want in power like your own son to be the vice president because you don't need competent people. You can always use consulting firms to help you to make public policy for you. This is what hinders the improvement of government because they know where government needs consulting firm is the area where they're lacking expertise in. You hinder the improvement by allowing them to constantly rely and increase the influence of consulting firm and to hire them to design the public policy. But not only that, considering that these are multinational company firms, this consulting firm, they will have access to potentially classified data of the nation. Because in order for you to solve an issue of a certain country per se, you need enough data and information. So how does it work then? The government will provide as all sorts of resources, informations, and knowledges that they have and that is needed by the consulting firm, in which could be very important and sacred towards the nation. Per se, how much budget do you have? Your tariffs, all your policies are designed by these consulting firms that are probably owned by like Americans, Europeans, and precisely then when they have access to it and they keep your solution and they would want you to keep on coming back, right? So if they provide you a solution, they will not tell you how did they come up with the solution. If a problem is re-emerging at the same problem again, then you will not have enough information or data or like past knowledge to solve that problem again. Meaning you would then have to hire more of the consulting firms. And this is then my biggest question to opening opposition. Are you really allowing this government to rely and use and like hire the consulting firms to hire public policy without them being competent enough? Please answer that, Renee.
I think consulting firms cannot help your shit cabinet and proctors, but at least it's an attempt for our government to understand. Reliance won't happen because it won't be sustainable for our government's face that relies on good public reactions, exactly like what Louis has already explained to you.
Here's the thing. What we want under our side is simple. If we want consulting firms to be the last contingency plan, and the government should be able to design their own public policy. And if they do fail, then so be it. Because if they fail, meaning it's not only a bad public policy making, it's a bad government. You have to replace that government. You have to evaluate and scrutinize the government. What you're allowing them to do is to hire consulting firms to do their job, shield them from like any potential scrutiny from the public because they're incompetent. As long as okay, I can hire a consulting firm, they will do my work for me. I just have to present this to people and say I came up with this solution, I came up with this plan. I'm a great government, vote for me again. These are the kind of government you're going to create under your side because you allow them to increase the influence of the consulting firm and you're creating even more reliance of them. Because if it's not solved by Indonesian government and it's solved by like consulting firms, likely there will be reliance to solve this problem in area where like government does not become a priority anymore. What do I mean by that? Meaning government does not even have the knowledge and will not bother to improve their knowledge upon that certain expertise of area. Let's say like data protection in Indonesia per se. The moment that they allow a certain incompetent people in power and they're in charge and all they do is hire consulting firms to solve national data security problem precisely when there is a problem, a huge massive problem that not even the consulting firms can do. All they can do is blame and not take accountability, which is precisely going to be even more harmful under your side. Because when you're trying to say that consulting is a redemption for their wrongdoings, then I don't think a government who mess up a public policy should be able to have a chance of redemption by simply hiring someone else to do their job. What they have to do is at the very least learn and evaluate. Or at the very least, if they cannot do so, then they must be replaced. This is what we allow by not relying on consulting firms. We provide to you transparency of the government. If you're incompetent, then you must be replaced. You can sure if you really need an in desperate last sorts of like solution, but if the solution needs to be publish as urgent as possible, you can use consulting firms. But what we regret is when you increase the influence of consulting firms to be hired by these people, these incompetent ones, that will then spread out our informations to multinational companies, to people who is profit oriented, that does not really care about what the government wants, because they want all they want is like to be aligned with their own profit and like revenue stream. This is going to be the biggest harm under your side when you allow the incompetent people to be in power. Proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Emo.
Yep, can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay, give me a second to split screen.
Patar, sorry. Can I
Okay,
go
okay,
to
okay. Yeah, you can notify me when you are done. Sharon, are you done? Why it takes so long? Okay, QA. MO.
Okay. What is a good public policy? This wasn't a question that is answered by the opening bench nor by CG. Two parameters. One is when policies are holistic and crafted by capable entities, knowing that there are different, like multiple backgrounds that exist within the country, that everyone is protected and governed under the policy. But second of all, it's also when people are convinced enough that these policies are good to be followed and to be obeyed. This is how closing opposition is going to enter the debate. We say that firms are the ones capable to create not only holistic policies, but is to convince people how their policies are going to be followed. Two problems with opening bench. First and foremost, there's such a simplistic process analysis in opening bench. What makes the government want to listen to aspirations in OG? Why are firms that capable of making these policies other than the fact that they have data? Like how are even like the data going to be gathered in opening opposition to craft these policies? All of those questions unanswered. But second of all, it's also there's very simplistic context analysis on policy making. It's not only about the process of making these policies, but can people understand you? Can people trust you enough to follow your policies? We don't think those questions have been answered. How are policies made? That's the second question I want to answer in this speech. First and foremost, under our of the House, the policy draft is going to be discussed within the Parliament anyway, but the people who make the policy draft are going to be consulting firms. So therefore, there's still going to be meetings, like Parliament meetings. Different commissions will still discuss whether or not to pass these policies. But this debate should operate in the context where these policies are passed to begin with, because it will be a symmetrical debate and symmetrical harm if these policies are not passed on both worlds. Second of all, governments will still function. Come on, it's not only about the legislative processes, but it's also about having executive and judiciary processes within the government. There will still be ministries making programs, making protection plans, whatsoever. So anything in regards to how people within the government will be out of touch, that's not the case. Like there's still people that will still want to visit areas that exist within ministries. Will tell you though why specifically in the legislative function it's very important for consulting firms to actually be involved. Two questions I'm going to answer in my case then. First and foremost, whether or not first regarding the political capability of consulting firms to make policies, like whether or not they are the most capable to make the public policies in this context. I have two problem analysis to address to you in this specific context. The reason as to why government officials are not capable is due to two things. First and foremost, government officials have more probability to be corrupted for a few reasons. A, that political party influence that causes them to cater towards only certain interests and ideology alignment exists. Like literally, PDP is influencing Jokowi throughout like the 10 years of his presidency. But second of all, it's also the fact that governments are also majority oriented. Therefore, they oftentimes leave minorities from certain policies that they make. OTPKS took so long to be passed because the majority conservative opinions just do not care about reproductive rights, and therefore they overbear the government voices for far too long. But the second problem here is also the fact that we have an arbitrary measure on whether or not government officials are actually capable of making these policies. Two contextualizations here. First and foremost, the problem as to why Indonesia's eastern development, like Papua, Sulawesi, whatsoever, is not that much of a development in comparison to the eastern or central part is because government officials do not want to visit those areas. Like people, like if you happen to notice it, people in the legislative do not visit Papua to understand enough why the public policy is good enough for them to implement in these areas. But second of all, it's also the fact that officials do not always get their position because of their merit. Things such as nepotism, bribery, etc., which is very apparent in the governmental system, especially if you want to talk about Indonesia as what OG tries to suggest. Like there's a lot of mechanisms for you to enter the government, and it's not always because you're an honest person. You can simply become a nepo baby whatsoever, and you can pass. So therefore, why are consulting firms most capable? There are three reasons that I want to address here. First and foremost is that you have holistic resources of data by consulting firms. What does this look like? It's not merely about the people who are knowledgeable like what OO suggests, but three characterizations. First, they have information on what has happened in society, the percentage of people impacted by certain phenomena or issues. They gather surveys, they create field studies. This is how the aspirations are gathered as what OG is concerned about. But second of all, is that different consulting backgrounds on different disputes also exist. Like it's not that they only deal about environmental issues, but also things such as poverty, things such as whatsoever is literally the background of a lot of these consulting firms. Data is not only about what's lacking and not, but also the understanding towards different kinds of disputes that exist in society. But third of all, it's also that they are internationally connected towards one another. Most likely in this debate and in this context, governments want to engage to top firms. So firms like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, PwC, whatsoever, they have international connections for them to understand how they tackle issues in different countries and what makes it successful or not, which makes them very knowledgeable. But second reason as to why they're capable is that people who are entering these firms, they have educational backgrounds and reputation. Usually, these people who attend business schools are equipped with classes on negotiations, consulting, and addressing issues, social issues whatsoever. There are certain standards in which you are expected to be competent in these top firms. But thirdly, then, is that you have a neutral third-party perspective to understand the greater good of all. There's less likelihood for political alignment in this context because neutrality influences their favorability within the competition with other firms. Like high level of professionalism is granted to these companies or firms because the competition is between private firms as well. Like if you're not able to provide a neutral and a good public policy for everyone that makes it inclusive, then other firms can outcompete you and become the preferred firms by not only the government, but also other private entities that want to consult to these firms to begin with. This is exactly different from politicians because politicians are very highly interested in private interest because they can secure it specifically behind closed doors. That's why this is very important. This is how the policies become holistic and have helicopter views. Because not only do we tell you that they have the capability to gather these data, but they have less interest to actually make it lean towards a certain view to begin with. Why do we win with this analysis alone? Two things. First and foremost, this wins over opening bench because we're the first team to make the sense of the premises. We explain process analysis for OO's case to run, and we answer the concern of aspiration coming from OG. But second, this tramples over CG's concern. Like if your only concern is basically derivative towards OG, we've already answered why. But second, regarding applicability of these policies, like whether or not people will want to follow along these policies to begin with, two requirements that we fulfill here. First, is regarding the reputation of the policymakers. If people understand that these consulting firms are people with background want with integrity and inclusive experience, they're likely to want to listen, because these are not the same people that are entering these policies or parliaments with nepotism and not trustworthy. The reason as to why we're entering an Indonesian government that's not too trustworthy is because they have bad reputation. Sorry. But second, it's also that there's inclusive policies that's most likely going to be crafted. Like if women feel safe under the UU TPKS, this is more likelihood as to why they want to cater or join the Indonesian government's like policies. All of those reasons, very proud to win.
Cool. Kawan web.
Hi, audible?
Yes.
Okay. 1 second, let me set the timer. All right, PI preference, just raise your hand. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so it's very funny that in the debate about consulting firms and about originality and about doing the work, we basically just had CEO mansplain everything that just happened in O. But other than that, let's talk about what opening debate spends their time on, right? Opening debate spends a significant amount of time talking about consulting firms, good versus bad. Consulting firm good this, consulting firm bad because of this. And to an extent, CEO completely also falls into this idea because this debate is not talking about consulting firms being good or bad. Because what CG has brought to you is that we don't care how good the policy that these consulting firms makes are. We care about how the government interacts with them, and that was what my members have explained and why I'm going to rebuild. The debate is about the increasing influence of consulting firms, which is happening at an alarming rate. Why does this increasing influence create reliance? Because the government can, because you have to understand that with the government, if they can put a lid on something and not care about it, they will, right? If they can find an easier solution to it, they will, because well, that's just how economics works, right? But we don't want this. We want to incentivize them to completely to rely on themselves more, right? The government can't know it all. We admit to this. But the government should, or at least have significant knowledge and strive to have significant knowledge on every single sector. That is the purpose of a government. If you can decide who gets the death penalty, if you can decide who has to starve in jail for life, then you can also decide who can play soccer and what policy should be made without the use of a consulting firm. The government should always strive to be self-sufficient because number one, it's literally their job, and number two, the only way a country's government can remain stable, because my member already explained to you how improvement goes down within the government cabinet because of the government's reliance on consulting firm. The same way it's bad for governments to rely on imported goods because the local economy wants to grow, and it's extremely risky because the moment this disappears, everything falls apart. And sure, it's an extreme case, but it's also an extreme risk that you do not want to put on an entire country's government, right? Because this is an entire country. There should be as little risk as possible. Sure, under our side, maybe the
Right.
worst case is the government takes more time to solve a problem. But just like a math problem, it's a lot better to take an hour on the homework and pass the test than have someone do the homework for you and then fail the test. Before that, yes, CEO.
Why do you think the government has all of these incentives to do all of the things that you're talking about right now?
I already explained to you that number one is the government, and number two, why would these incentives exist under your side, especially when they have something else to rely on, right? Speaking of something else to rely on, let's move on to CO, right? I think CO basically shot themselves in the foot from the first sentence they said, where they basically said that every policy made by a consulting firm has to go through the government first. Okay, sure. And then they say they give you a 5-minute long rant about how the government is corrupt and they don't care about anything. So what's exclusive about CO if all the consulting firm's job relies on the government that they explain how bad they are anyway, right? Because understand the reason why the government has this increasing influence on consulting firms. It's not because they're lazy, it's not because they just don't want to do their work, but because governments often have underdeveloped areas. For example, Indonesia is underdeveloped in sports. We think that initial hiring of consulting is okay for the worst case scenario. But if it continues, then the sports division in Indonesia will be completely relied on foreign consulting, which is not only bad because of the previous reasons that maybe the foreign consulting policy is not that good for Indonesia, but even if the policies are good for Indonesia, then what happens if the consulting maybe goes bankrupt? What happens if the consulting firms that have handled these problems for Indonesia, for Indonesia's entire life or the past 10 years, they go away, or maybe they're bought by another country, or maybe they're no longer able to work for Indonesia. Everything comes crashing down, and what's left is a government within the country that has no fucking idea how to do the job they're supposed to do in the first place. We are not saying the policies are always going to be bad, but that even when the policies are good, the influence of them, because the government is horrible, because the government just say, oh look, this consulting firm solved this problem for me, let's just use them forever. Okay, let's just rely on them to do the rest of the work within this specific division, and let's just pour all of our money back into like increasing the money of gold or increasing the mining of Papua, for example, right? Because the counterfactual is actually very clear. Let's look at things that have been handled by the government, even though they're really hard issues to tackle. Let's look at transportation within Indonesia, within Jakarta, where transportation is an extremely hard issue to handle. But the Indonesian government came forward and they didn't hire a consulting firm, they do this and that. It's the entire Indonesian government own effort to rebuild the transportation. And now because it worked in Jakarta, they're able to implement it in so many other places because they did it themselves. The cabinet is already built, everything is already there, the solutions are there. So we don't understand COs like problems, because they literally go on a rant of like, oh yeah, the government is bad, blah blah blah. They only cater to the majority, and then they give you no explanation on how the consulting agency doesn't cater to the majority. Because guess what, guys? The consulting agency's problem is to cater to the government. So whatever the government wants, the consulting agency has to appeal to that. So if the government wants this, and the only way for the consulting agency to appeal is through data. How do they get data? Well, they don't care as long as they get the data. We increase the economy by 30%. Oh, did we have to use Papuan slave labor to do it? We don't care. Give it to the government. They see the data, they like us, they pay us. Easy, easy, easy. So what is the problems here, right? So what about OO? OO is basically running on defending firms, and again, opening debate kind of focuses a lot on this. That's our differentiation with our opening. No thanks. The government they say that, oh yeah, the government's at least like trying to do their job, we should give them credit. No. The government should always be criticized no matter what. You can't say, oh, but they're trying so hard. And even this is not an excuse, because the government can still, when they hire a consulting firm, if they tried again to solve a problem, then sure, let them hire a consulting firm. But if they completely rely on this consulting firm with this increasing influence, then we already showed you the world that is horrible. The reason why my POI to Renee was so important, asking how the government will understand the people's needs if all the consulting firm is, if that's the consulting firm jobs to do to understand the people's needs, it's because the only way the government can solve the problems now is by relying on consulting firm, because their consulting firm is the one that has all the data. The consulting firm is the one that does everything. They have no defense against the actual influence of itself. They're just arguing about why consulting firms are good. There's nothing exclusive on their own side. The same thing with OG, right? Because we don't think this debate should be about government listening to people more or generating more happiness within people, because all of this assumes the firm's policy are bad. We show you that even if the policies are good, that the policies are amazing, and they have the full interest of the country in mind, then it's still bad for the country. OG says reliance is bad because government becomes lazy. But we show you the framing that CG plays on, that reliance is bad because of the risk, because of the cabinets within the government not being good enough, because of the government's reliance on these things being a bad thing for a country, because you're the government of a country. Why are you relying on something else? You are what the people are supposed to be relying on. Proud to oppose. I propose.
Next.
Am I audible?
Yes.
The thing that is lacking in both government benches is they never necessarily understand the difference between legislative and also executive. What will most likely changes with this debate implemented is most likely the legitimate bodies in the legislative power, which is to create and enact policy. Therefore, their concern regarding government are going to be lazy in executing the policies, and taking a look towards people on the ground are very, very much, out of touch. The most important thing here to understand is that the reason as to why merit is that important in policy making is because policy is something very much restrictive and detrimental towards civilians' life. Therefore, this specific merit can
can be prioritized in comparison to all the harms that government benches when they talk about how government is going to be lazy, on how government is going to be out of touch towards the people, which is first, it has no likelihood, but second, even if it happens, there is no significant harm that they can propose to the table anyway. But before moving on to my two clashes, I would like to kick out both opening benches and even closing government benches to a certain extent because they're somehow derivative towards OG. OO then. I think it's very not sufficient for OO to only explain about why consultant is good, because if that's the case, then OG is concerned about democratic feature that are uniquely held by the parliament still stands anyway. Therefore, CO is going to fill in that gap. But OG then, within that, OG's burden and also CG's burden is not only to say why consulting firm is bad, and why it's going to bring a bad impact towards like the government, but it's also to address why parliament is the only legitimate actor in creating policy. This is the burden they never explained, because factually speaking, if their concern is only about representation, in which consulting firm is also part of the society, is also a legitimate law entity who is also legitimate to have voice in determining what policy that should and should not restrict society, we question. Two clashes that I'm going to bring in my speech. First, why is parliament incompetent to begin with to kick both government benches? But second, in which side the policy is going to be better? First clash then, why is the parliament incompetent? I believe that Risky has told you a lot of beautiful things to tackle government's claim on how like government is going to be lazy in making policy and interact with the society. If this is the case and this happens, we're willing to bite the bullet and say we don't fucking care, because we think that they're less competent in making policies anyway. Look at the parliament. Most of the officials in the parliament are the output of mega coalition where they need to lick each other's ass and pander towards each other. So if you're basically the minority inside of the parliament, you need to cater to people. But second, we're living in the majority votes. We're living in the majority's choices, where most of the time minorities' votes are not necessarily represented anyway, because most of the time the one in the parliament are voted by the majority. But thirdly, parliament is a one-size-fits-all, where they cook all policies there. What is unfortunate is that there is no requirement of specialization for people to be in the parliament. But lastly, when parliament makes policy for preemptive measures, usually consulting firms deals with their clients for curative measure, how to solve the dispute, how to solve ABC problem. What does it mean? This means that in the idea of parliament competency, we have to admit and be aware that their competence is in question. But second, we also have to admit that consulting firm holds more experience in solving day-to-day basis problem. They know the loophole of the policies made by the government. The weighing is simple. I think when you weigh which one is more legitimate, I think we're prioritizing merit to actually cook a good policy. You know which actor has the best merit to do so. But even if we have to sacrifice all those things, say, but then that's totally fine, because at least the policy is going to be better under our SEPTA House, which is much more applicable. That leads me to my second clash, in which that the policy is going to be better. But before moving on to my second clash, yes, POI.
So rather than allowing the governments that are Nepo babies to fail their public policy and get scrutinized, you want them to hire experts to cover up their lack of competency. Is that what you want?
First, when you're talking about corrupted and also strangled parliament, this has been an embedded and also has been a structural problem. So you cannot solve it in just one presidential election or in 5 years. But policy is something that is time sensitive. You need to solve it now. But even if it's the fault of the parliament or people incumbent, we think that one, we still have social repercussion to also demand for reparation for that to happen. People are not dumb enough. People are aware that this is a thing. That is why people were angry mad when Prabowo was voted as the president. Moving to my second clash then, what is the metric of good policy? Risky has told you wonderfully. First, adaptability and applicability. But second, representative. I think in the idea of adaptability and applicability is talking about whether or not people are able to follow and obey towards the policy that are made. Why policy needs to be applicable, adaptable is because first, I've told you that policy issue is something time sensitive. You need a preventive measure through policy to make people feel secure, to make people feel protected from anything unwanted. But second, I think policy is the only thing that binds people and restrict people to not disturb each other. But you also have to understand the adaptability and applicability is something that needs to be taken into account, because in following policies, some of your rights are taken away, your freedom are taken away. Why then is going to be achieved better inside CO? First, we have education experience. Rizky has wonderfully told you why we have more education and experience. For example, like the mega big four, they have firms around the world and they have study comparison in between all those branches and how to solve the problems. But second, you have better reputation of the policy makers, in which other than its neutrality, because most of the time private consulting firms are not affiliated with the government anyway, but most likely they have their research publicized, or they have like their dispute publicized. But most likely, because of its neutrality and more study cases that they have, most likely it's going to be inclusive in terms of policy. Understand that we're living in a popular sovereignty. That's why you need a neutral third party who owns more data and statistics to be able to create a policy to cater to minority, where minority whose votes are taken away and not represented in the parliament are more represented under CO negate.